I said, I'm not okay lately, and my son rolled his eyes. He didn't even look up from his plate. Can we just eat? He said, as if my words were nothing more than static in the background. I felt the sting, sharp and immediate, but I swallowed it down, letting the silence settle between us like a second, heavier meal. I wanted to believe he didn't mean to be cruel, that maybe he just didn't know what to do with a mother who suddenly stopped pretending everything was fine. Dinner continued. The clatter of forks, the scrape of a chair, the sound of chewing, these became the language of our family. I watched him, my son, his hair falling into his eyes, his fingers drumming against the table. He was 15, old enough to be annoyed by me, young enough to still need rides to school. I remembered when he was small and would crawl into my lap, his arms tight around my neck. Now, he barely noticed if I was in the room. I thought about the moment all day. At work, the memory replayed in my mind, as persistent as a song stuck on repeat. I wondered if I had made a mistake, if I should have kept my feelings to myself. Maybe mothers weren't supposed to be honest about their struggles. Maybe I was supposed to smile, serve dinner, and keep my pain hidden behind polite conversation and questions about homework. But I was tired of pretending, tired of carrying the weight alone. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like a warning. I made coffee, staring at the dark liquid swirling in my mug. I thought about texting my sister, about telling her how lost I felt, but I worried she'd just tell me to hang in there, the way people do when they don't know what else to say. I wanted something more than sympathy. I wanted understanding. A tea breakfast. My son sat across from me, scrolling through his phone. I tried to catch his eye, but he kept his gaze fixed on the screen. I asked if he slept well. He shrugged. I asked if he needed anything for school. Another shrug. I wondered when our conversations had become so empty, when my voice had started to sound like background noise to him. When he left for school, I stood by the window and watched him walk down the driveway. I remembered the first day I walked him to kindergarten, his small hand in mine, his backpack almost bigger than he was. I wondered if he remembered that day, if he remembered how tightly he had held my hand. Now, he didn't even say goodbye. At work, I tried to focus on my tasks, but my mind kept drifting. I thought about my son's face, the way he had looked at me, impatient, annoyed, embarrassed. I wondered if I had failed him somehow, if my honesty had made things worse. I replayed the dinner conversation in my head, searching for a different outcome, a version where he listened, where he cared. By lunchtime, I felt invisible. I ate alone at my desk, scrolling through social media, watching other families laugh and smile in carefully curated photos. I wondered if they ever felt like this, tired, disconnected, uncertain. I wondered if anyone ever posted about the nights when words fell flat and love felt like a one-way street. After work, I picked up my son from school. He got in the car, earbuds in, music leaking out in tinny bursts. I asked about his day. He said, fine. I asked if he had homework. Yeah. I asked if he wanted to talk. Silence. I drove home, the radio filling the space between us. I wanted to reach out, to say something that would break through the wall, but I didn't know how. That evening, I made his favorite dinner, spaghetti with too much cheese. I set the table, hoping the gesture would mean something. He came to the table, glanced at the food and muttered, thanks. We ate in silence. I watched him, searching for signs of the little boy I used to know. He finished quickly, stood up, and said, I'm going to my room. I nodded, forcing a smile. Alone in the kitchen, I stared at the empty chair across from me. I thought about all the things I wanted to say, how much I missed him, how hard it was to be strong all the time, how lonely it felt to be invisible in your own home. But I said nothing. I cleaned up, washed the dishes, and tried to convince myself that tomorrow would be different. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. I wondered when I had started to disappear. I wondered if my son even noticed. I wondered if I was asking for too much, if expecting understanding from a teenager was just another way to set myself up for disappointment. But I couldn't stop hoping. I couldn't stop wanting more. I promised myself I would try again tomorrow. I would keep reaching out, even if it hurt. I would keep showing up, even if I felt invisible. Because that's what mothers do. We keep going, even when we're not okay. We keep loving, even when it feels like no one is listening. And maybe, just maybe, One day he'll look up from his plate and see me not just as the person who makes dinner, but as someone who needs him too. The next day began with the same routine, but something inside me felt heavier. I moved through the motions, making coffee, packing lunches, checking my calendar, but each task seemed to echo the emptiness I'd felt at the dinner table. My son came into the kitchen, headphones around his neck, eyes still puffy from sleep. He mumbled a greeting, barely audible, and poured himself cereal. I tried to find the right words, something that wouldn't sound like another plea for attention or a reminder of my disappointment. Instead, I asked if he had any plans after school. He shrugged, spooned cereal into his mouth, and scrolled on his phone. Our conversation was a series of short exchanges, each one landing flat, each one reminding me of the distance that had grown between us. On the drive to school, the silence was different. It wasn't angry or tense, just tired. I glanced at him, searching for any sign that he was still the boy I remembered, curious, talkative, eager to share his thoughts. But he stared out the window, lost in his own world. I wanted to reach him, to tell him that I missed him, but the words caught in my throat. I dropped him off, watched him disappear into the crowd, and wondered if he even noticed the way I waited, hoping for a backward glance. At work, I tried to focus, but everything felt muted. My colleagues chatted about weekend plans, shared stories about their kids, laughed at jokes that didn't land for me. I smiled and nodded, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept thinking about my son, about the way he had dismissed me at dinner, about how hard it was to admit that I wasn't okay. I wondered if other parents felt this way, if anyone ever talked about the loneliness that can settle in even the busiest homes. During lunch, I scrolled through old photos on my phone, birthday parties, vacations, moments when my son's smile was easy and his laughter filled the room. I tried to remember what it felt like to be needed, to be the center of his world. Now, I felt like a background character in his life, someone he barely noticed unless he needed a ride or a meal. I wondered if this was just a phase, if things would get better with time, or if I was losing him for good. That afternoon, I left work early, hoping to surprise him. I stopped by his favorite bakery, picked up the cookies he used to love, and drove home with a small sense of hope. When he walked in, I offered him a cookie. He took one, muttered thanks, and headed to his room. I stood in the hallway, cookie tin in hand, and listened to the muffled sound of music through his door. I wanted to knock, to ask if we could talk, but I was afraid of another rejection. Dinner was quiet again. I tried to start a conversation, asking about his classes, his friends, anything that might spark a response. He answered with single words, barely looking up from his plate. I felt invisible, my efforts dissolving into the silence. After dinner, he disappeared into his room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chairs, and wondered what had changed. Was it me? Was it him? Was it just the way things went between parents and teenagers? I tried to remember what it was like to be his age, to feel misunderstood, to want space. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away, something I wasn't ready to lose. Later that night, I sent him a message, just a simple "I love you," hoping it might reach him in a way my words hadn't. I watched the screen, waiting for a reply. Minutes passed, then hours. Finally, a single word appeared. "You too." It wasn't much, but it was something. I held onto it, letting it remind me that even when things felt hopeless, there was still a connection, however small. I lay in bed, replaying the day in my mind. I thought about the moments I'd tried to reach out, the ways I'd tried to show him that I cared. I wondered if he understood how hard it was for me, how much I wanted things to be different. I promised myself I would keep trying, even when it hurt, even when I felt invisible. Because that's what resilience is, not giving up, even when the odds feel stacked against you. As I drifted off to sleep, I reminded myself that change doesn't happen overnight. Relationships are built one moment at a time, one small gesture after another. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew I would keep showing up, keep loving him, keep hoping for the day when he would look up and see me not just as his mother, but as a person who needed him too. The following week unfolded in fragments. Each day, I found myself searching for small signs that things might shift. I noticed the way my son lingered a second longer in the kitchen before heading to his room, the way he paused at the door as if wanting to say something, but stopping himself. I clung to these moments, uncertain if they meant anything, or if I was just desperate for hope. The distance between us felt like a living thing, sometimes shrinking, sometimes stretching, always present. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, I heard him talking with a friend on the phone. His laughter drifted down the hallway, light and unguarded. I stood in the kitchen, hands still, listening. It struck me how different he sounded with his friends, confident, relaxed, his words spilling out without hesitation. I wondered when I had last heard him laugh like that with me. The realization stung, but I tried to remind myself that teenagers need their own space, their own world. That night, I decided to try something different. Instead of asking questions, I simply sat beside him on the couch while he watched television. I didn't speak, didn't push. I just sat, sharing the space, letting him know I was there. At first, he seemed uncomfortable, glancing at me with a raised eyebrow. But after a while, he relaxed, and we watched in silence. It wasn't much, but it felt like a start, a quiet truce, a way of saying, I'm here if you need me. The next day, I left a note in his backpack. It was brief, just a reminder that I loved him and that I was always there to listen, no matter what. I didn't expect a response. That afternoon, when he came home, he didn't mention the note, but I noticed he left his door slightly open while doing homework. It was a small thing, but it felt like an invitation, a signal that maybe he was ready to let me in, even just a little. Work remained a blur of meetings and deadlines, but I found myself less distracted by my worries. I started reaching out to friends, sharing some of what I was going through. To my surprise, several admitted they had felt the same way with their own teenagers, shut out, invisible, uncertain. Their honesty was a relief. I realized I wasn't alone, that my struggles weren't a sign of failure but a part of the messy, complicated reality of raising a child. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, my son appeared in the doorway. He hesitated, then asked if I could help him with a project for school. My heart leapt at the opportunity. We sat together at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and colored markers. He explained what he needed, and as we worked, our conversation drifted from the assignment to his favorite music, his friends, even a few stories from his childhood. For the first time in weeks, I felt like we were connecting, not as mother and son locked in a silent battle, but as two people sharing a moment. After we finished, he lingered at the table, tapping his fingers against the wood. Thanks, he said quietly, not meeting my eyes. I smiled, telling him I was always happy to help. He nodded, then retreated to his room, but the door stayed ajar. I sat for a long time, replaying the conversation, feeling a cautious sense of hope. That night, I wrote in my journal, something I hadn't done in months. I wrote about the small victories, the ways I was learning to let go of my expectations and meet my son where he was. I wrote about the pain of feeling invisible, but also about the strength it took to keep trying. I realized that resilience wasn't just about enduring hardship, it was about adapting, about finding new ways to reach out, even when the old ways no longer worked. As I turned out the light, I thought about the journey ahead. I knew there would be setbacks, days when the distance between us felt insurmountable. But I also knew that every small step mattered, that every gesture of love, no matter how quiet, was a thread connecting us. I promised myself I would keep holding on, keep showing up, and keep believing that one day my son would see me not just as his mother, but as a person who needed him too. The days that followed were a series of cautious steps forward, each one fragile, each one easily undone by a single careless word or misunderstood glance. I learned to measure progress in moments, a door left open, a question answered with more than a monosyllable, a shared laugh over something trivial on television. I tried not to cling too tightly to these signs, afraid that my hope might scare them away. Instead, I focused on being present, on offering my attention without demand, my support without expectation. One Friday evening, my son came home later than usual. He dropped his backpack by the door and hovered in the hallway, uncertain. I was in the kitchen, finishing dinner, and I called out to him, careful to keep my tone light. He hesitated, then joined me, sitting at the counter while I chopped vegetables. For a while, we talked about nothing in particular: school, a movie he wanted to see, the new band he'd discovered. I listened, genuinely interested, and resisted the urge to turn the conversation toward my own worries. For the first time in a long while, the air between us felt easy. After dinner, as I loaded the dishwasher, he lingered in the kitchen. I could sense he wanted to say something, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. I waited, giving him space. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet. "You seem sad lately," he said, not meeting my eyes. The admission caught me off guard. I had spent so long feeling invisible, I almost didn't recognize the moment for what it was, a crack in the wall between us. I took a breath. "I have been," I said, keeping my voice steady. "It's been a hard time for me." I didn't elaborate, didn't burden him with details, just offered the truth in its simplest form. He nodded, fiddling with the edge of his sleeve. "I didn't know what to say," he admitted. "It's weird when parents talk about stuff like that." His honesty was awkward, but it was real. "I get it," I told him. "Sometimes I don't know what to say either. I just want you to know you can always talk to me about anything." He nodded again, and for a moment, silence settled between us, not heavy, but comfortable. I realized then that connection didn't always come from perfect words or grand gestures. Sometimes, it was enough to simply be honest, to let the other person see you as you are. That weekend, we spent more time together. We went grocery shopping, arguing over which cereal to buy. We watched a movie, disagreeing about the ending. We laughed at a video online, the sound of his laughter filling the room in a way I hadn't heard in months. Each moment felt like a small victory, a reminder that the distance between us could be bridged, one ordinary day at a time. Still, not everything was easy. There were setbacks, nights when he retreated to his room, mornings when he barely spoke. I tried to remind myself that this was normal, that progress wasn't always linear. I learned to accept the ebb and flow, to celebrate the good days and survive the hard ones. I reached out to friends more often, sharing my struggles, finding comfort in their understanding. I realized that I didn't have to do this alone, that asking for help was not a weakness but a form of strength. One evening, as we sat together after dinner, my son turned to me. "Are you okay?" he asked, the question tentative but sincere. I smiled, feeling the weight of the past weeks lift just a little. "I'm getting there," I said. "Thanks for asking." He nodded, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes, a recognition that I was more than just his mother, that I was a person with my own struggles, my own need for care. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about how far we had come. The journey wasn't over, and I knew there would be more difficult days ahead. But I also knew that we had found a way to reach each other, to speak honestly, to listen. I felt a quiet sense of pride, not just in my son, but in myself. I had faced the silence, the rejection, the loneliness, and I had not given up. I had learned to be patient, to adapt, to keep loving even when it hurt. As sleep finally came, I held on to the hope that tomorrow would bring more moments of connection, more chances to show my son and myself that resilience is not about never falling, but about always finding the strength to get back up. The final week arrived with a sense of cautious optimism. I noticed how our home felt less tense, how the silences were no longer heavy, but simply quiet. My son and I had begun to find a rhythm, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always moving forward. The small moments we shared had started to add up, forming a new kind of connection built on patience, honesty, and gradual trust. One afternoon, he came home from school and found me reading in the living room. He hesitated at the doorway, then sat down across from me. There was no phone in his hand, no headphones around his neck. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then quietly he said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about not being okay." His voice was uncertain but sincere. I put my book aside, giving him my full attention. He told me about the pressures he'd been feeling: school, friends, the unspoken expectation to act like nothing ever bothered him. He admitted he didn't always know how to talk about his feelings, that sometimes it was easier to roll his eyes or shut the door than to admit he was struggling too. I listened, practicing the patience I'd been learning, letting him speak without interruption or judgment. I realized that all the advice about active listening, empathy, and choosing the right moment to talk was true. These strategies were not just theory, but the foundation of real communication between us. 135. When he finished, I thanked him for trusting me. I told him I understood, that I'd felt lost too, and that it was okay for both of us to have hard days. We talked about ways to support each other, agreeing to try for more honesty, even if it felt awkward at first. I promised not to push too hard, and he promised to let me in when he could. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a beginning. That evening, we cooked dinner together. He chose the recipe, and we worked side by side, sharing tasks and stories. There were moments of laughter, moments of silence, and a sense of ease that hadn't existed before. We set the table together, and as we ate, the conversation flowed more naturally. He asked about my day, and I asked about his, each of us listening with genuine interest. The meal ended without tension, just a quiet sense of mutual respect. Over the next few days, we continued to build on this new foundation. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we didn't, but the door was always open. I learned to accept that communication with a teenager would never be perfect, that there would always be setbacks and misunderstandings. But I also learned that resilience meant showing up again and again, even when it was hard. 57. It meant loving without conditions, listening without judgment, and giving space when needed. I began to see my son not just as the child I had raised, but as a young person, finding his own way. I respected his need for independence, but I also made sure he knew I was there, steady and constant. I realized that the best way to bridge the gap between us was not through grand gestures or forced conversations, but through small, consistent acts of care and understanding. 135. One night, as we sat together watching television, he turned to me and said, "I'm glad we talked." It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of everything we had been through. I smiled, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. I knew there would still be difficult days, but I also knew we had found a way to move forward together, imperfect but connected. As I lay in bed that night, I thought about the journey we had taken. I remembered the pain of feeling invisible, the fear of losing my son, the struggle to reach across the silence. But I also remembered the moments of hope, the small victories, the gradual rebuilding of trust. I realized that I had changed too, not just as a mother, but as a person. I had learned to be patient, to listen, to let go of my need for control. In the end, the greatest transformation was not just in our relationship, but in myself. I had discovered a quiet strength, a resilience that carried me through the hardest days. I had learned that it was okay to not be okay, and that asking for help was not a weakness, but a sign of courage. Most of all, I had learned that love is not about perfection, but about persistence, the willingness to keep trying, to keep reaching out, no matter how many times you are met with silence. Our story was not extraordinary, but it was real. It was built on ordinary moments, on mistakes and forgiveness, on the slow, steady work of rebuilding trust. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt grateful for my son, for our imperfect connection, and for the resilience that had brought us both back to each other.